Hello and welcome to this presentation on APA formatting and style. This will be an introduction to APA formatting and style. This is not an exhaustive presentation. Throughout this presentation there are links to the APA website for the various sections that I'll be discussing. And you are expected to go and look at those links as well for further information and to be able to master your APA writing style. So first, what is APA style? The publication manual of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, contains the guidelines for formatting a paper in APA style. And APA style is the most commonly used style for formatting papers in the social sciences, such as in business, economics, psychology, sociology, nursing, etc. There are always updates to APA style on the APA website and in the APA manual, the 7th edition. So APA format provides writers with a format for cross-referencing their sources from their parenthetical references to their reference page. And this cross-referencing system allows readers to locate the publication information of source material. And this is a great value for researchers who may want to locate your sources for their own research projects. The proper use of APA style also shows the credibility of writers. Such writers show accountability to their source material. Most importantly, the use of APA style can protect writers from plagiarism, which is the purposeful or accidental use of source material by other writers without giving appropriate credit. Also, APA does speak to the stylistics in terms of grammar, word choice, punctuation, all those various different types of things in how you present your information. Essentially, what writing in APA style does is it helps to guide your readers through your writing in a standardized format so that anyone can read it and understand your writing and your information, and it makes sure that you're giving credit where credit is due for the sources that you're using for your information. The first thing that I'll just touch on really quickly is some information on grammar, on stylistics, on writing. And so it used to be in our writing that we would write from a lot more of a third-person standpoint and refer to ourselves as the author, speaking in lots more third-person terms, and that has shifted to where we can speak of ourselves in the third person. If you're a single author, you can refer to yourself as I. I conducted an experiment. I found that. If you're writing as a group of authors, you would use we instead of the authors. And this is something that may or may not be looked favorably upon in your writing by different people in different sectors. So some people may really still prefer that third person voicing and point of view, but it is perfectly acceptable now to write in a first person point of view. We still want to pay attention to writing in a very professional manner, but it is okay to speak in the first person. And there's the website for grammar, so you can go there to find out a bunch of information about what I'm talking about here. In terms of voicing, there's a difference between active and passive voicing. A lot of times in the way we speak colloquially, verbally, we speak in the passive a lot. And we tend to do this in our writing as well. And so there's nothing wrong with writing in the passive voice, but it is better to write more directly in the active voice. And so here's a couple of examples of that on this page. The main difference here is the difference between being direct with what we're saying and kind of being talking in a roundabout way or beating around the bush in what we're saying. So we want to make sure to be as direct as possible in our voicing. In terms of language, we just want to be sure to be as clear, as concise as we can in our writing and use as plain of language as we can. Clarity and conciseness are not always the easiest to balance because we want to be clear where we give enough information in our descriptions and explanations, but we also want to be concise and not be overly verbose or wordy or put too much information out there. And so there's a balance there between the two of those. In terms of plain language, we want to use information that that most people would understand, that we want to use words and language descriptions that most people would be able to grasp and not have to spend a lot of time looking up the meaning of your information. And so we want to avoid using metaphors, minimize the use of figurative language, and not make this a creative writing experience, but more just plain in the way we're presenting information. In terms of wording, we want to be really careful about word choice. And the second bullet here says no bias. And the reason we want to be careful about word choice is to limit the bias that we spin on our writing, and to make sure that we're actually saying what we're intending to say. Words have intended meanings, and we want to choose the precise words to mean what we actually mean in our writing. And so we don't want to use any slang. There are some examples there of what slang would be. We want to try and eliminate bias as much as possible in our language, and so just being very careful of how we are using terms to refer to individuals. We don't want to label people, and so we want to be clear with what we're talking about with groups of people rather than giving them a colloquial label. We also don't ever want to state proof in our writing, and so with research we're not actually proving anything. We are finding out information that helps us understand topics and questions more. We're not actually proving things, and so we don't want to say we proved anything. We can say that we suggest, or the results of our research suggest or indicate something, but it doesn't actually prove. And with that, we want to be careful about drawing conclusions from our information. We don't want to spin conclusions with any bias. We don't want to draw conclusions that aren't actually coming from the research. We can give interpretations of what the results of our research are, but those interpretations need to be grounded in other research and in theory and in what the data actually says. And so we just want to be very careful about any conclusions that we might be drawing. This website, or this link down here to the bias-free language section of the APA website, is really a good section to go read in full to be exploring how to write in a bias-free manner. Just really quick, contractions. We do not use those. So see right there, I said we do not use those. So just do not use contractions in your writing at all. In terms of numbers, there's specific areas where we would use the full word for the number, like written out with letters, versus the numeral. And so as a general rule, 0 through 9, you're going to write out the full word. For 10 and above, you're going to write out the numeral. There's some areas where you would still write out the full word, like at the beginning of a sentence. You're not going to start that with a numeral. And there's a few other areas where you would use the full word. And there's some areas where you would use the number instead of written out as well. And so there's some information there. And again, there's a couple of links on various other spelling and hyphenation areas, as well as rules on numbers. Okay, abbreviations and acronyms. And so sometimes, a lot of time, maybe you might want to write the shortened version of something. Like here down below, we have an example of Human Development and Family Studies, which is a program of study. And typically it's abbreviated as HDFS. And that's absolutely fine to do with APA formatting and style. What you're going to want to do, though, is the first time that you put that acronym out there, you want to list the full words of the name, the title, whatever, first, and then put the acronym in parentheses, because we want to define what that acronym means. From there forward, you can use that acronym in the rest of the paper. Now, if you're only going to use that acronym a limited number of times, maybe don't even abbreviate it at all. If you're only going to use it 2 or 3 times throughout your paper, just go ahead and do the full statement or phrase there. And also, like, let's say you use it various times in your introduction section, but then you don't use it for a while until the end of your paper. It could be good to use the full term again, and then again provide the acronym and use it from there forth, maybe for the rest of the discussion section. You also want to treat your abstract as separately from your paper, though. So if you've used the acronym throughout your paper, do list out the full term of the words in the abstract as well, and provide the acronym there as well. Okay, in terms of punctuation, It used to be that you would use a double space after any punctuation at the end of a sentence. That was APA 6th edition. That has changed, and so now it is a single space after any punctuation at the end of a sentence, period, exclamation point, question mark, whatever. So just use a single space there. In terms of commas, please use the Oxford or the serial comma when you're listing things in a sentence. So here's an example of 3 things in a list. The reason for this is that when you don't use that last comma before the word and, you're technically grouping those last 2 items in that list together and saying that those hang together instead of they are separate things in a list. You'll want to use a semicolon in place of a comma where you have a list within a sentence where there's groupings of things that hang together and there's lists of those different groupings. And so if you're making several statements that get separated, that would typically get separated by commas, but those things have clauses within them and separate thoughts within them that in and of themselves get separated by commas, separate those different sections with semicolons. You could also just create different sentences if it's starting to get too convoluted that way. In terms of parentheses and brackets, parentheses are used to give extra information within that sentence. And so sometimes maybe if you need to give extra information within that extra information, you wouldn't use parentheses again within parentheses, you would instead use brackets within parentheses to offset that even further. We're going to talk about quotations and quotation marks a little bit later, but this is another difference from APA 6th, the 7th edition. It used to be that you would use italics to offset a word, to highlight it, to give emphasis to it, but we're no longer doing that in APA 7. We are now using quotation marks to highlight a word or set of words. Even if you're not directly quoting that, quotes are being used to highlight that word and offset it from the rest of the sentence, give it emphasis. Okay, you may want to use lists in your writing. And so lists are a great way to really clearly and just cleanly separate things from the rest of a paragraph. You can do that within a sentence, or you can do it in more of a separate from the paragraph format. If you're doing it in a sentence, you're going to want to use letters for that. So letter parenthesis and then the first item in the list, then B parenthesis first item or next item in the list, and so on and so forth. If you want to use numbers for a list, that's absolutely fine as well, but that wouldn't go within a sentence. That would be broken out in a more sequential format, in a vertical format. Same with bullets, and either of those are fine to use. You just want to separate those out from a sentence instead of including them in a sentence. Just a note here, numbers may better signify order, whereas bullets may be less or not ordered. So if you're wanting things to go in a certain order, you may provide a list with either the letters or the numbers. If it's bullets, they may not be taken as being in a certain specific order. Okay, that is it in terms of style and grammar and overall writing. There's a lot of information in that, and there's a lot more information than that, so please do go back to the APA manual or website and read about that in full. We're going to move on now to the general format of your paper, what your paper should look like. And so all of your papers should be typed. We're not doing handwriting here. We're typing on a computer through a word processing program. All papers should be double spaced, and that should just be a setting that you have. You don't have to hit enter after every line. You just make sure everything is double spaced. There should be 1-inch margins all around. That's on left, right, top, and bottom. You should be using a standard font, something like Times New Roman in 10 to 12 point, and that point is going to depend on the font size you use. Some things might be okay in 11 point, some things might be okay in 10 point. We're just kind of wanting to get the general size and feel of writing that your standard paper has. So it used to be that we only wrote in Times New Roman 12-point font, and so if you just want to kind of go for the old standard, that is fine to do, but you can use other standardized fonts at this point now. If you're printing a paper, it should be on standard American 8.5 by 11 paper. If you're just turning things in electronically, then that would be what the word processing program is already formatted for. And every page should have a page number and a page header. We'll talk more about those in just a little bit here. And those would go in the header section of the electronic document rather than in the body. And so in word processing programs, if you click usually up above the body towards the head of the page, it will let you get into the header section, and that's where the page number and header would go rather than in the main text. Okay. In terms of the layout of your paper, most finalized papers should include these 4 major sections. And this is for any scholarly writing that you're doing. A title page, generally an abstract, maybe not necessarily unless it is something you're putting out there for publication or for really quick glance. The main body of your writing, and then a references page. You may also, after the references, have appendices, and we'll talk a little bit about those later, but typically you're going to have these 4 main sections in a finalized paper or product. And every page of your paper, like I've said before, should include a page number in the upper right-hand corner of the header section. If it's a professional paper, it will always have the page header, which is a shortened version of your title, all in caps, and that'll go in the upper left-hand corner of the header section. Student papers don't require running headers, but for the purposes of what we're doing here, we're going to have you do running headers for everything. So here's a note on that. The APA 7 has slightly different formatting rules for professional and student papers. Professional papers would be those intended for academic or commercial publication, while student papers are those written for credit in a course. And the main differences there do extend to the title page and the information that's on a title page and that running header. So the purposes for the purposes of this class, since we're graduate students here and we're going to be learning how to conduct research and write for professional purposes and for scholarly purposes, we're going to always use the formatting rules for professional papers. If you were writing for an undergraduate course, you might just use the student rules though. And you always kind of want to defer to the instructor of the course if you're writing for a course. Okay, so here are the kind of general rules for student papers. If you'll notice, there's no page header there. It just has, well, there's a heading where it has the page number, but that's all that's there. It doesn't have that running head there. For the title area of the page or the paper, it has the title, it has your name, it has the academic department, the course, the instructor, and the date. And so again, this is for student papers, and so don't use this as an example for what you're doing in this class. For this class and for any future writing you'll be doing, you're going to follow this example of a professional paper where in that header section you do have the running head, the page header, where it is a shortened version of the title. If your title is short already, you could put the whole title there, but if your title is more than a few words, you'd want to shorten that down. And then that would be all in caps, flush to the left, and then on the right-hand side you would have the page number there. For the main body of your title page, it's going to look a little different than the student version as well, where you have the title, which is kind of in the upper half of the page. You're going to have that centered, and that's going to be bold. And then you're going to have your name, no titles or degrees in there. And then you're only going to have the affiliation underneath that, so the college, university you're at. And if it's a single author, you're just going to have the single name. If you want to put a middle initial in there, that's fine. If it's multiple authors, those are going to be separated with commas, and before the last author, you're going to have the word "and" written out. If you were writing with people for multiple institutions or affiliations, you would put the different universities or institutes that they are part of listed out there as well. Okay, for the title of the paper itself, APA recommends no more than 12 words in a title, so you've got some space to be descriptive, but you also don't want to be exhausted in that title. If you're going beyond 12 words, you want to narrow that down. So also on the title page, you can include some additional information under an author's note. This might be where you put any differences in affiliation, any changes, any acknowledgements or disclosures you need to put out there. There's some more things you could put in there. Again, for the purposes of this class, though, we're not going to be doing any of that. That would be if you were, submitting things for publication or if you needed to make other special notes right up front. So after the title page, we have the abstract page. And this is kind of the start of your work, where you give a synopsis of your research or your paper that talks about the information that you're going to be talking about in the paper. It gives a brief view into kind of the overall introduction, research questions that you have, brief support for why we're doing that, and then some information about the results and findings of what you've got. So everything kind of goes in there in a very shortened format. You would still have the running head up there, the header for professional papers and for this class with the page number. The abstract gets, or the word abstract gets centered and bolded at the top of the page as a heading. The text starts on the next line and it is left justified. You don't make an indentation there. Abstract should only be about 150 to 250 words, and so you don't have a lot of space to create that summary. After the abstract, you can also follow it with a list of keywords, and there's formatting that you would do for that as well. And so look that up on APA as well if you wanted to put some keywords. From there, after the abstract, we move into the main body, or all of the text of your paper. And so this is all of the different sections that you would have in a standard paper, starting with an introduction and a lit review, and then a research method section, the results and discussion. And so all of the text is considered the main body. And so you're going to start that first page of main text with page number 3 in the upper right-hand corner of your header, with the page heading up there as well. Your title page would be page 1, abstract would be page 2, so that's why for this we're starting with page number 3. For the main body, you are going to start with the full title of your paper as the first heading. You're going to center that, it's going to be put in bold, and then you're not going to put any other headings after it to start the introduction to your paper. Just the main paper title in bold centered is the first heading that you'll use. And then you'll just start with the introduction to your paper. Again, you're going to type the text double spaced with all of the different sections of the paper following each other without any breaks. So you're not going to put any extra space between sections. So if you get to the end of your intro and you're going to go into a lit review, don't hit enter again. Just hit enter once and put your next heading there for literature review, and you'll move forward. You'll also use section headings between and within sections. And so for each of your main sections, you're going to use level 1 headings, which we'll get to here in just a second. And you're going to use level 2, level 3, level 4, whatever headings to offset different pieces of information within those various sections. Also, in your writing, you're going to make sure to identify the sources you use in the paper with either narrative citations or parenthetical in-text citations. So we'll talk more about those in a second here. You'll also include tables and figures in your paper, mainly in the results section, and there are specific ways to format those as well. So here's what headings look like. So there's 5 different levels of headings in APA 7, and they're a little bit different than they were in APA 6, but they're really easy to grasp. Here are examples of those and how they're centered or justified to the left, where the text of the new paragraph begins, etc., etc. And so you'll want to use these throughout your paper to offset sections to guide the reader through and help the reader understand where different pieces of information hang together within sections and subsections of your paper. When you insert tables and figures into your paper, I'm going to go to the next slide real quick. So tables and figures, there are specific ways that those should be formatted in terms of the title, the heading of it, the table itself, and grid lines and like shading, all that type of stuff. There are specific ways that those should be formatted. And so you'll want to go to the APA website or the APA manual frequently if you're using tables and figures to just make sure that those are in proper APA style. And that's all I'm really going to say about that, except that tables and figures are a good way to present information concisely and where it makes sense to do so graphically. You don't necessarily want to repeat things in the table or figure that you've already said in your written text. You kind of want to use those to display the information in a different way than you'd be able to write. You still want to give an introduction or some explanation of the table or figure within the text, why it's there, what it points to, but you don't need to just be completely redundant and say everything in both formats. Okay, so I just want to touch on appendices really quick before we talk about references and citation. So appendices, you may have a paper or you may not. For the purpose of this class, you will have at least, actually you'll have 2 appendices. But what appendices are is they're a place to stick content that doesn't make sense to go in the paper, but would still be good for the reader to have access to. And so these go after your reference page. They do not have to follow APA formatting in terms of the content that is within each appendix, but you should still follow APA formatting in terms of the heading. So a level 1 heading of Appendix A, Appendix B, etc., where it's bold and centered. And then the content of the appendix can follow directly afterwards, but does not have to be in APA formatting. So appendices contain documents like a measure, instrument, or questionnaire you use to gather data, an informed consent form that you gave to participants in a research study, lists of things that you referred to within your text but didn't want to put fully in your text because it would take up a lot of room. Those could all go in as an appendix. And so when you refer to an appendix in your text, that lets the reader know that they can go to that appendix and find that information if they want to go deeper into it. And as you introduce them in the text, you want to begin with Appendix A. And so let's say you're writing and you need to, you're writing and you refer to Appendix A, and then you realize, oh, I need to refer to this other appendix before that. You want to reorder things so that the first appendix you talk about in your writing is the first appendix that's listed. And so it's okay to have to go back there and reformat things, reorganize things. You might even need to reorganize the appendices themselves based on how they are written about. That's fine. It's just something to know and to take care of. And those go at the end after your references section. Okay, speaking of references section, here is our information about references pages. And so, like mentioned before, reference pages are there to show that these are the sources where we got information that helps back up our statements that we're making throughout our writing. And so there are specific ways to format reference entries and a reference page itself. And I'll go through those, but anything that you have, any source that you have used to support your writing, support your statements, support your thoughts, needs to be cited in the text, and then it also needs to be included in the reference page. And the reason for that is when somebody sees in your writing a citation, they can then take that citation, go to your reference page, find all of the information that they need in order to go find that original source so that they could read that for themselves if they desire. And so we're always wanting to, again, give credit where credit is due. We're always wanting to not plagiarize and not take credit on our own, but point people to original sources. So that's why we always have a reference page in APA style. So for your reference page itself, it's formatted with the title of references at the top. This one is not in bold. It is just the word references centered on the middle of the page, at the top of the page. The reference page is double spaced, just like the rest of your paper, and you don't put any extra space between reference entries. For the first line of each reference entry, it's going to be fully left justified, so no indentation. But all of the subsequent lines after that first line are going to have a hanging indentation. And so just when you're writing that out, go to the second line, hit tab, and that will indent the rest of the reference entry for you. You're also going to list reference entries alphabetically by the last name or the surname of the first author of each work, not second author. You're also not going to reorder the author's names. And again, here's a link to APA's requirements on references, so you can dig into that further. So in terms of making the reference list, APA is a complex system of citation. You want to be able to identify if the source you're using, what type of source it is. Is it a book, a journal article, a web page? There are specific ways to cite each different type of source. And you can look at the Purdue OWL website, you can look at the APA manual, you can look at the APA website, but just make sure that you do go back to one of those sources to find out how you insert each reference entry into your reference page, because there are specific differences for each type. So just identify what type source it is, and then you don't have to have it memorized how you put that in there. Just go to the APA manual or something and look at how do I do it for this time, and then mimic that, mirror that sample for your reference page. And then again, make sure that entries are always listed in alphabetical order and that the subsequent lines are indented. When you put the authors in there, which you're going to start with, you invert their name, so it's their author name followed by their first initial, sometimes maybe middle initial if they've included that as well. And then you're going to put the year that it was produced in parentheses after that. Again, never rearrange the order of the authors. They're in that order for a specific reason by primary author and secondary, etc., etc. In terms of the title of the source, so not the journal title, but the article title or the book title, only capitalize the first word of a title and a subtitle, and the first word after a colon or dash in the title, and proper nouns. Don't capitalize the first word of the second word in a hyphenated compound word, though. So basically, first word after a colon or separating sentence hyphen, or proper nouns. Nothing else should be capitalized in there. So this is a good example of that right there. A lot of what you're going to be using as references will be journal articles, things from scholarly journals that have been peer reviewed. And so here's what that looks like in terms of a reference entry, where you capitalize for the title of the article, only the first word is capitalized there. For the journal title itself, not the article title, but the journal title, you do capitalize all major words for that. You also italicize the name of the journal as well as the volume number. But then you put the issue number in parentheses and you do not italicize that. You include the page numbers, not italicized. And then you would also include the DOI or URL where that source can be found out if that's available. So a little bit more on DOI and URL. DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier, and URL is the link. I don't remember what it stands for, but the link where you can find that source ad online. And so you want to do your diligence to find the DOI, if possible, for an article or for a book or some other source, and include that in there. There's been some more standardizing of that, so they should be available. If you cannot find a DOI, that's fine. It does not have to 100% be included. Just really do due diligence for putting it in there, or for including the URL. Sometimes you might put retrieve from, put the URL, sometimes you wouldn't. Go look at the APA examples of when you would include those words and how you include that all in there for your reference entry. All right, so that's kind of the end of the formatting of references, and we'll move on to citations here, but I often get the question of how many references and citations do I need? And the answer really is as many as is needed. So you want to have enough references and enough citations throughout your paper to support your statements and your claims. So anytime you're making a statement or you're asserting something in your writing that's not fully your own content or not common knowledge, you need to have a reference or a source to support that statement. Even if it is your own content, it's something that maybe you didn't read somewhere, but you came up with on your own, you still probably need some support for that, because when we're trying to make assertions, we don't just want to put those out blindly on our own. You want to have support for what you're trying to say. And so it's still good to go say, okay, what did other researchers, what did other authors find about this, say about this? How does it support what I'm trying to say? And give credibility to your statements that way, saying other people found this as well. It's not just me saying this. And so the question of common knowledge is, well, what is common knowledge? There's some things that might be common knowledge and may not need support through a reference or a citation, but there's some things that even might be quote unquote common knowledge, but again still might need support. So as a rule, just go find support for what you're saying. If you're trying to say something, somebody else has probably said something that can support it, so go look. Also, as you're looking for people or for sources that support what you're saying, if you're finding things that refute what you're saying, that is absolutely good, fine and good as well, because a lot of times we need to shift our thinking on things and think about things different ways. And so allow yourself to be influenced by what you're finding out there from prior research. And don't just keep trying to say what it is you're trying to say if other things absolutely refute that. Okay. In-text citations. This is our last section. There's a little bit more information in here, but I'll try not to go too long. In-text citations help the reader to, again, locate that information in the references section of the paper. And so we want to use in-text citations wherever we're referring to source material. And there's specific ways to do this. In terms of putting it in a parenthetical citation or putting it in a narrative citation. So a parenthetical citation would be at the end of a sentence where you've kind of just talked about things, paraphrased things, talked about specific research from one study, or maybe you made a statement where you've got multiple studies that support that. You can put the author's last name or names with the year in parentheses at the end of a sentence to show this is where that information came from. You can also more specifically refer to sources or studies in your narrative to bring things back to that author or authors. And this is how you would do that. You would say something like Atkins, and then the year suggests blah, 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 blah. You never want to have a year hanging out on its own, though. So if you're doing a narrative, you wouldn't say Atkins suggests that the Pooter Owl is a good resource for students and then put the year at the end of the sentence. The last name and the year are always tied together, so you never want a year just hanging out on its own. In terms of quotations and in-text citations, you can quote, but I would encourage you, and you'll want to quote sparingly if quoting at all. Try to limit quotations to maximum of 2 quotes in your writing. Really, you want to be paraphrasing things and putting it in your own words, and you want to be synthesizing things together around your topic in your writing rather than just quoting source material. Quoting source material, it's kind of lazy, and it makes it so that you're not having to integrate and synthesize things as much. And so I would encourage you to not use quotations at all if possible. Sometimes, you do need to quote because you've got a real zinger and it's just best if we read it in the author's original words. And that's fine. That is fine to do. You just really want to limit that and not rely on quotations. And so if you're quoting, you can use, again, both the parenthetical or the narrative style citation, and here's what those would look like. If you're quoting, you do want to use a page number. We'll talk more about that in a second here, but you want to include the page number where that quote can be found. And you also want to use signal phrases to introduce the quote. So you don't just want to just throw in a random quote and it's like, oh, how did this get introduced? Oh, it didn't. No, you want to use signal phrases that lead into the quote, not just throw it in there randomly. If you're using a quote that's more than 40 characters long, you're going to offset that quote in a freestanding indented blocks of text on a new line separate from the paragraph the quote is part of. So sorry that I just read that to you, but basically you're going to offset it in a continuation of the paragraph, but separate from it, fully indented as a block of text separately from the paragraph so that it's not taking up normal paragraph space. Okay, page numbers. Again, if you are directly quoting, always include the page number where that quote can be found from your original source. If you're offering a summary or a paraphrase, you don't have to include page numbers. That's not required. You can just cite with the author and the year without a page number. But If it would be helpful for the reader to quickly find that original source material, you can include the page number like you would for a direct quote, and you would just include that in the parenthetical or narrative citation like you would with any other citation, just as you would with a quote. And that can be helpful because maybe, let's say you've got several pages worth of content from an original source where you're synthesizing those and you're paraphrasing them down into a shorter manner, but you want the reader to be able to go and quickly find where that bigger section of the original source is. That would be a good place to use page numbers with a summary or a paraphrase. Okay, here's just what page numbers look like within the parenthetical or within the narrative citation. So where years do not hang out on their own, if it's in the narrative, it's okay for page numbers to hang out their own. If it's one page, you use a P period in the number. If it's multiple pages, PP period in the page numbers. Okay, summarizing and paraphrasing. Again, these are much better to use than directly quoting because it shows that you're taking the information, you're synthesizing it, you're taking multiple ideas together, and you're synthesizing it into your own writing and your own thoughts. And here's what citations would look like for summarizing or paraphrasing. Do this all over the place. Take source material, summarize it, paraphrase it, synthesize it into your content in a way that flows naturally, that shows support for what you're saying, that lets the source material expand upon your thoughts, but also integrates it into your ideas and your questions and the story you're trying to tell. We want to write our original content. We want to write our research questions and statements and support for those, and we want to have it fully supported. And by paraphrasing and integrating it into your thoughts and your writing, it helps the reader see that this is original work from you and it is fully supported, and that you've done your due diligence to integrate prior research and other thoughts into it. It's not just your own. So always summarize and paraphrase and cite things throughout your writing. If a source, okay, in your citations, you want to refer to authors only by their last names, and you don't want to include titles of articles, books, or resources. And so you don't want to say like Joshua Valdez 2017 found in this article and then name the article. You just want to use the last name, Valdez found that, and then kind of refer to what the article went into or the source went into, but don't actually include the title of that source or that article. As with quotes, you're going to want to use signal phrases even in summaries and paraphrasing when you're using citations. You want to lead into those, and so it's really good to get a rich repertoire of signal words so that you can include those in your writing and refer to how those authors or how those sources have information that refers to what it is you're trying to get across. So sometimes you may want to include multiple works as support for a statement that you're trying to make, and that's absolutely fine. If you're saying something that is more kind of common knowledge or a really simple concept to grasp, maybe one source is fine for supporting that. But maybe if you're trying to put forth something that's a little bit more high context or a little bit more out there, and we need to show that there's more support than just me saying this or more than just one other person saying it, it's like, no, really, a lot of people have found this. It's okay to have multiple references that speak to that. And you don't have to speak about them separately. You can just talk about that statement that you're trying to say and then list those different sources in there with parenthetical citation separated by semicolons. So that's perfectly fine to do. Yeah, and then you would just move on. You could also do that in narrative as well, but it's a little easier to do it in parenthetical just by saying, hey, here's my thoughts, here's what I'm trying to say, and here's a parenthetical citation showing support for that, rather than saying something like Adams 2018 as well as Collins 2017 found that blah, blah, blah. It can be just easier to do it in parenthetical citations. Not all works only have one author, though, and so if you have only two authors on a work, there are different ways to cite those for narrative and parenthetical citation. The main difference is that in narrative citation, you're going to use the word "and" between the authors' last names, and then in parenthetical, you're going to use an ampersand between their names. If you have more than two authors, though, this is a change for APA 7. Anything with 3 or more authors, you're only going to use the first author's last name and then the words "et al." And it's a Latin phrase meaning basically "and the rest." So Lynn and the rest, and then the year. Or that can also be done in a parenthetical citation at all. So anytime you have more than 3 authors, just get rid of everybody but the first author's last name, use "et al." and the year. Sometimes you won't know the author. Sometimes maybe if it's a book or a chapter or something, or a website where you don't know the author, you can refer to that book itself, and there's ways to do that specifically. Go look at APA for more information on that. Same kind of with group authors. Maybe you don't have a specific person author, but you have an organization like the Food and Drug Administration or the APA itself. There are specific ways to cite those. You can go look those up on APA as well. If authors have the same last name, you want to differentiate who you're actually referring to, and so you can use the first initial there in the parenthetical or text citation as well, and that's how you would do that. If you're citing multiple works by the same author that are published in the same year, that happens as well. If a researcher is very prolific and churns lots of things out in the same year, you would just use letters A, B, C after that to show which source you are referring to within your reference list and guide the reader to that. We also might cite personal communication lists. So let's say you did an interview with somebody and you want to talk about that in your writing. That's absolutely fine to do. But there's specific ways to cite that within your text, and this is what that looks like, whether it's a narrative or a parenthetical citation. The only difference here is we do not include those personal communications in the reference list. Those are only cited in the text. And the reason for that is the reference list is a list of things that the reader can go back and actually find themselves. Things that they can go find and read and review again on their own. Things that are out there to be reviewed. Personal communication, nobody can go back to that. That's just something that you did in an interview or something. So that would only be cited in the text. So do not put that in the reference list, but it's fine to cite those in your text. And with that, that's all I've got for this presentation. That should be plenty to get you started with writing in APA style and format. And so please come back, review this as needed, download these slides and go through them as much as needed. There's links throughout. Please go view the APA website, look through the APA manual, go to the Purdue OWL website. One thing I will say is that you do not have to have any of this memorized. There's a lot of this that I don't have memorized, but I know where to find the information on it. And so all you have to know is, hey, I need to write an APA and I need to be able to find where I should be, where I need to look in order to format things correctly. And then go look. So if you have any question, any concern about, is this an APA? That's fine to have that concern. Go look it up and change anything you need to. And so just go through your papers, go through your products with a fine-tooth comb and say, okay, what do I need to tweak and change to make this fully in APA style? And with that, I encourage you to now go for and start writing.